Hey everyone, welcome to a very impromptu BRAP rant. I wasn't planning on doing a rant. I was thinking about maybe doing a rant this evening, but this is very, very impromptu. I actually reached out to Falky, who was kind enough to join us. I said, Falky, hey, can you do like a quick BRAP rant in about 30 minutes? He said, sure. So he's kind enough to hop on. So thank you, Falky. I appreciate it. Hey, happy New Year to you, sir. We haven't, this is your first time podcasting with BRAP in 2024. How are you today, Falky?
Doing quite well, thank you. Welcome to the new year to everybody who's made it. All the best for a safe and successful 2024.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, and the reason I wanted to have you on is because, and this is something that I discussed, I believe it was last week or the week before, about the finances or the expenses behind AAA game development. And I part of the issue I have sometimes, Falky, with the conversation around the gaming narrative is that, the gaming discourse is that it's often based on what people hear in echo chambers. And we have so much information out there, Falky. We have this thing called the internet. You may have heard about it, Falky. We have this thing called Google. You may have heard about that too. We have financial analysts such as yourself who look at companies' financial health, professionally speaking, do this as you know to earn a living. We have subject matter experts in a variety of other fields, analysts. We have Matt Piscatella of Circana NPD. We have GameIndustry.biz, who does a phenomenal job at reporting industry trends, giving us updates on trends and great interviews. Like they did an interview with Sean Layden, which we'll talk about Sean here in just a second. But there's just an abundance of information. I think what happens, unfortunately, is that people go to certain podcasts and it's very much an echo chamber, and it's just there's a lot of misinformation or disinformation that gets spread because for whatever reason, Falky, you and I mean, we talked about this earlier in the week. Like, how do some of these people get by in life? There's a lack of critical thought analysis when it comes to looking at financial data, when it comes to being able to kind of connect the dots and listening to what companies are telling us, looking at their behaviors or actions, looking at past historical trends. It's the ability to critically think, Falky. And you probably know where I'm going with this. It's just that ability to connect the dots. There's a lack of that. Yeah. And this is why I do these rants, because one, I'm not saying we get it right all the time here on BRAP, but as I said many a times, our show's different. Our perspective isn't rooted in fandom. We try to do a lot of due diligence in researching topics, reading up on topics, reading what subject matter experts have to say about certain trends in the industry. And then we have guests such as yourself who have specialties, expertise, professionally speaking, that can come on and provide some additional insight and kind of fill those gaps where we might not have that understanding. And this is why, Falky, like we have you come on, because you can kind of give us an idea of the finances when these companies release their quarterly financials. We can have those conversations with you. You're able to kind of dissect and explain to us what some of these numbers mean. So, but on that note, so this conversation around sustainability, Falky, and I'm sure you've seen this on the Twitters. You may have heard this on podcast. What was interesting today is I was listening to a podcast and I heard someone say that essentially that Sony's kind of in financial trouble right now because of the cost of their AAA game development. It is something that they've been aware of for some time, and this person mentioned Sean Layden, and it's that's not exactly correct. A couple things here. This isn't just a Sony problem, by the way, the cost of AAA development. This is an industry problem. But a couple things, Falky. And I'm going to ask you this question. assuming this person is correct, if Sony is, and I've heard this narrative, Sony is in dire straits or Sony is in financial trouble because of the rising costs of AAA game development. And I heard this individual say, and other individuals as well, saying that AAA model they have isn't sustainable. Sean Layden has said it. There's more to what Sean Layden said that people are taking out of context and not necessarily connecting the dots. Okay,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
here's my understanding of business, and I work for an organization that does external audit of finances, financial statements. So I'm privy to getting a lot of industry trends and getting a perspective of how companies operate, mostly Fortune 500 companies, publicly traded organizations. I'm not saying I have the level of expertise that you do, Falky, because I don't crunch numbers, nor am I a bean counter. But I have an understanding because of I have to read up on some of these trends and analysis and things like that. And what I do understand is if organizations, if their business is unsustainable, they're not making investments in those areas that are unsustainable. Would you agree with that,
Correct.
Falky?
Absolutely. If it's not sustainable, well, I say yes, but there's a bit more complicated than just that. If you look at each segment individually and they're taken on their individual merit, then yes, they're not going to invest money in something that's got no return to shareholders or got no impact to the broader business. However, multiple things taken together may have a positive impact on the business, and there's just some segments don't perform and other segments do, and it comes down to where do you record all this crap and how do you do the analysis and what numbers are included and what numbers are excluded, as we've said multiple times. But fundamentally, a business will not invest money into something that is not going to generate a return in the short, medium, or long term.
Yes, and if we step back and we look at remember the bar graph that unfortunately people don't understand how to read bar graphs either. That's something else that I
Yeah.
remember the investment bar graph.
Oh, that fucking thing.
Yeah.
Yes,
so
I remember that bar graph and base
remember they're invested
concepts
more. What's that?
Basic concepts that people should have learnt in grade 5 maths, and adults can't read these things.
I at least here in the U.S., I do believe that their education system is failing us here. When I see people who can't read bar graphs, who can't see that the bar graph is showing you that the increase in investment in AAA first-party games is increasing when you compare it to and it's fairly simple. It's designated by color. The color bar is higher than the previous the previous bars. That alone should tell you that the investment is increasing. But
simple concepts. But again, it comes down to, I always chuckle when they said someone will snip that bar graph and put it up and they say, see, this is that they're not doing this. And like, no, they're actually are, because if you read the graph properly, as it should be interpreted, as for illustrative purposes, they're actually not just increasing what they're investing in terms of their traditional story-driven, narrative-driven, single-player for third-person games and all the rest of it, but they are then going to contribute more to developing their games as a service. But they don't specify what games as a service means. They don't specify how much money is going to be involved, other than to tie it back and say it's effectively going to be 105% more than what we're already investing. So then you've got to go back to the financial reports to work out what that number is, and you've got to be able to dissect that. But when the people get pointed out that they can't read that graph properly, they throw their hands in the air and go, oh, I don't care about business stuff. I'm just going to say it how I see it. Like, well, if you didn't read the whole thing in its entirety and understand that whole section in its entirety, then shut your mouth and don't say anything, because you look like a freaking idiot.
Yeah, I mean, and that is part of the frustration I have with the dialogue when people start talking about financials and trends in the industry, that they often get their news, if you will, or they regurgitate what they've heard in these echo chambers. And I've always said that the democratization of information is in my opinion has been a bit dangerous. I've seen it here in the U.S. I'm not going to get into why I think that, but I'll throw out a date for you, January 6th here in the U.S. And so it is, and I'll throw it, during COVID. But that's another conversation. But so Falky, what as I'm hearing this person say this, and I've heard other people say this about, that model isn't sustainable. Well, then you have to take a step back and look and say, okay, well, if the model's not sustainable, then what is the next step for Sony? And we just talked about this at the start of the show, that if a certain business line is not sustainable, then these companies are going to pivot. They're going to say, you know what, it's the shareholders aren't happy about this. It doesn't make financial sense to us. We're going to pivot in a different direction. We're going to either we're going to stop making AAA games. We're going to get out of, much like Sega did, we're going to get out of the hardware business. We're going to change our business model. Yes. To an extent, Microsoft pivoting, hey, we can't sell software. We need to figure out how to get more software into the hands of gamers so that we can increase our revenue. I mean, but you're not seeing that. You're not seeing that in Sony's behavior. And I mentioned that bar graph because if you look at that bar graph, there's increases of spending in AAA to get development into the future. We see that, right? Would you agree with that, Falky?
Yeah, I would. And further to that point, if they were serious about just cutting it off and being done with it, when Connie Booth went, they would have shut down Naughty Dog, Sony Santa Monica, and Sucker Punch. They'd have just said, fuck it, we're not doing it anymore, and that was it. That's the reality of where those things are at in terms of, what it costs to run those studios. They're the three bleed points, and Sony said, no, we're going to change management, we're going to double down and reinvest, and hey, look, Naughty Dog have said, we've got this thing to a playable state with factions too, but we don't want to be a single game studio. We want to keep doing the things we want to do, so we're going to shelve it. And management at PlayStation went, no worries, shelve it. So, then they're clearly got the stones on them to say, all right, well, we'll back you in because we believe that you're going to keep producing quality. Yeah.
And this is where I think where I have to get frustrated, because I think that the fandom takes over. And it's not just this critical thought analysis of let's think about the behavior. Let's think about a behavior of an organization whose business model is sustainable and what they do. It's the opposite of what you just described, Falky. We're not saying we want to focus on AAA first party, or AAA narrative-driven games. That's what we do best. We want to focus on that, and they're doing it.
Yeah.
There's investments.
The flip side of that one with Naughty Dog is, we've invested all this money to get this thing to a point. Now we want to see some return on it. You will release it, come hell or high water. If you don't want to support it going forward, that's fine, but you need to make sure there's enough in there to at least break even on this thing and get something to fund the next one. Mm-hmm. Because that's the high risk stakes that Sony, or PlayStation particularly, still exists in. They don't have an empty, a bottomless bucket of money that they can just keep pulling money out of, going, well, we'll just keep funding you until the end of time, no matter whether you produce anything or not. At some point, they've got to kick something out the gate. And to reference back to, they will only invest in things that are worth investing in. Does anyone remember Japan Studios?
Yeah.
Anyone remember?
I was disappointed.
What was the one over in England that they shut down? I can't remember that one.
I can't remember, but yeah, they shut down.
It was a Drive Club or something like that. They shut them down.
Yeah.
Pixel Opus.
Yeah.
Sad that they're gone, but the main guy there left. They had 6 people there, and they didn't have anything, so they gave him a timeline, said, come up with something worth investing in, otherwise we'll just turn that one off and you can go and work with SDS. The XDev is huge. People sleep on XDev so much. XDev in PlayStation is monstrous. It would make any of their current studio holdings, except for Bungie, look small. there are that many developers, producers, and artists and all the rest of it in XDev that are just working feverishly. People just go, oh, well, they don't count because they're not producing their own stuff. They're working on second and third party. Like, who cares? Sony, PlayStation doesn't care because it's giving them something they can put in their storefront to sell. And the investment in XDev is getting them a far greater return than pouring money into more studios. And then we get into this whole conversation down the pathway of partnerships and engagements with third parties and second parties. And like, yeah, I could go on for days about how that makes financial sense. But, you know, as you say, the fandom gets involved and they start banging their chest about something extremely specific that just suits their argument. And they're not interested in having a conversation.
Yeah, the conversation is always much more nuanced, and that's the part that's missing in the dialogue here that I'm hearing in the community, in certain, you know, YouTube channels, podcasts. It's much more nuanced than, oh, well, the leaked documents from that release from Insomniac show that AAA game is that it's not sustainable. They're rethinking it. They don't understand why a game costs $300 million. That, by the way, that piece, that seems to me that was a bean counter, because that's how a bean counter would talk.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead, Faki. If
you took that, because nothing that first, for disclosure, I didn't seek out any of that stuff for a couple of different reasons. One, I'm not going to take possession. Well, I legally can't take possession or you know, have in my possession documents that were obtained illegally for professional reasons. I'm not interested in information that doesn't have time and date stamps on it, and that I wasn't involved in the conversations with, because who knows how much of what circumstance that was covering. Is it what if and maybe Doom scenario testing, or is it a genuine this is what happened in a meeting conversation? Because I've been involved in, we spoke in messages, I've been involved in conversations where we've had loss of life scenario testing, and what does that look like in terms of risk and litigation and all the rest of it. That comes across as a testing scenario, but that doesn't mean that it actually happened. But it's got, you know, all the it looks, if someone just grabbed that in isolation, didn't realize it was for a test, that it would look like, yes, something like this had happened. And if it got out all over the internet, well, then the damage would be irreparable. But because it's taken in isolation, you don't actually know if that's what's happened or not. So the stuff with Insomniac, yes, they're talking about all these huge costs, and they talk about all this other stuff from the conversations I've had with people who've actually read all this, that I do trust that their interpretation is accurate. But it doesn't say when it was from. It doesn't say what context it was in. It doesn't say a lot of other things. And if you're going to say $300 million to build a game, well, there's only a couple of games that could relate to, and it may be that they are factoring in everything against that game to run that studio for 5 years. Well, that's fine, but then you're basically saying that one game has to recoup everything for 8 or 10 other games that are also sharing the costs, which are then not being attributed. Mm-hmm. And things like, you know, game budgets are this and game budgets are that. The game budget's $100 million. That's just the direct cost to build a game. That is labor, technology, direct technology inputs, and other stuff. That is it. That doesn't include SG&A, marketing, corporate overheads, national overheads, taxes, depreciation, amortization, technical allowances, facilities, occupancy costs, additional provisions and stuff that goes on with the labor, all of that. Doesn't include any of that crap. But if the budget is $100 million and you say, well, add another $100 million on to cover everything else, there's $200 million to build whatever the game is, and then you release it into the wild and they sell it and they make $400 or $500 million out of it. Well, once you've factored everything in, then you're genuine, did this game make money for this company or not? And that's the point that a lot of people just can't concept and understand. Yes, the numbers are huge, but those numbers are covering everything. Everything. Even the oxygen people are breathing is getting dollars put against it half the time.
Yeah.
And once you've factored all that in and you wind it down to, is this number here above zero or below zero? If it's above zero, then that feeds back into the shareholders' earnings to a degree. Then you invest in it. Simple as that. That's why net present value calculations and discounted cash flow calculations and all this other shit occur when you go in and do a project. And people need to stop thinking of gaming like they're building them in an accounting firm or they're building them in a retail shop or something like that. They're not. It's not mass manufacturing. Think of it like construction project development. There's huge amounts of money invested up front for a long period of build time, and then there's a cash out at the end. And the cash out may be instantaneous for a short period of time, or it may have longer legs on it. It just depends. If you're building a sky-rise building and selling say it's a 5-story building and it's got 10 rooms on each story, on each floor, 50 rooms, and you're going to sell the whole lot of them. And you've put $1 billion up to build this thing, and you sell all these units at the end of it, and you've made $3 billion. Well, you factor in the cost of the investment plus the time it's taken to build it and all the rest of it, and the cost of having that money not earning somewhere else, because you've got to factor that in. And then you sell all these things either off the plan or at the end of it, and that's it. It's done. In a 3-year period, you've sold 50 units, and that's it. Then you take your money and you do something else with it. That's one way of doing it, and that's the traditional. Think of that like the traditional gaming. Because once you've sold them all in the initial bump in the first couple of months, it tails off and it's just bugger all money coming through. If you do the games as a service where you spend, say, 2/3 of that, $500 million to build the game, and then you're doing content as you go on, once you've released it and put it into the wild, you get that bump initially if you're selling it. Otherwise, if it's free to play, then you're reliant on the microtransactions. That's like building those 50 units, but renting them all out, and you're the landlord. And you're constantly having to get people to pay rent, and either paying higher rent as you go further and further in time, or you want them to churn through these things and have to, basically churn your tenants out more frequently to generate the money. They've both got pros and cons, and they both require a large investment up front. You try and build Fortnite today. Think about how much that would cost. They talk about AAA game development is unsustainable. Well, no, it's not unsustainable. It's just that we expect more to be in there. So we're not spending more money, or developers aren't spending more money on the same build stuff and the same technology. They're spending more money because there's more going in it. And the cost of the value add is actually coming down. They're just putting more in because they can. At some point, some bean counter, or, like myself, says to the big bosses, hey, that's it. No more into this one. Otherwise, you're not going to make any money back on it in these windows of return that you want. And they go, all right, cool. That's all you get. That's what we're going to run with. Cut that shit out and ship it.
Yeah. And to your point about the increased cost of game development, I want to go to what Sean Layden said, because this is where people are taking, and I had this conversation about a year and a half ago about the cost of AAA games. People were upset about $70 the price of AAA games being $70, and what I said to people, I was like, look, gaming's actually cheaper. The cost of AAA games is actually cheaper than it was today than it was 25 years ago, even 11 years ago at the start of the last console generation. And people looked at me like I was crazy. There's a great article by GameIndustry.biz that's actually entitled "Is Gaming More Expensive Today?" or something. I'd have to pull it up again. And there's the inflationary dynamic, and I get it. Most consumers, Falky, I think you'd agree with this. Most consumers aren't thinking about the inflationary dynamic when it comes to pricing. They see, I used to pay $60 and now I'm paying $70. That's $10 more, right? But what's happened is that the cost of game development has gone up, but what we're paying in the cost of AAA game development has gone up. When you do the math and you adjust for for inflation, and fuck, I don't know, I don't recall how long you've been gaming for. I don't think we had that conversation.
I don't think we've gone in detail on it, but I have mentioned it. I started on a Sega Mega Drive 2 in 92, 93.
Okay.
That was my first console, and I've been, yeah, been around it ever since the early 90s. So I jumped on, I had a Sega Mega Drive 2, and one of my neighbours had a Super Nintendo, and then, jumped on the PS1 and in 97 and just went from there.
So, Falky, games typically in 1992 here in the U.S. at least cost $50. Okay,
Yeah.
that's equivalent to paying $107.21 today in 2024 U.S. dollars.
That's right.
And how much are video games today?
I believe they're $70 US.
Yeah. So here's what Layden's, and this is where I kind of I don't know, maybe it's a pet peeve of mine, but where I'm like, there's a lot of information out here, and people are taking what Layden said. Oh, well, Layden said, the AAA game space is Sony's model is unsustainable. Well, here's what he says. I'm going to read this real quick, Falky. He says, the problem with that model is that it's just not sustainable. Explaining that the current generation has seen the cost of development reach between $80 million and $150 million for most AAA games, excluding market costs, with production taking up to 5 years from start to finish. He says, I don't think that in the next generation you can take those numbers, multiply them by 2, and think that you can grow. I think the industry as a whole needs to sit back and go, all right, what are we building? What's the audience expectation? What is the best way to get our story across and say what we need to say? It's hard for every adventure game to shoot for 50 to 60 hours, or 60. It's hard for every adventure game to shoot for the 50 to 60 hour gameplay milestone, because that's going to be so much more expensive to achieve. In the end, you may close some interesting creators and their stories out of the market if that's the kind of threshold they have to meet. We have to reevaluate that. Okay.
Yep.
So, and there's some other. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was. You keep going.
All right. So what I was going to say is, I understand what he's saying about this idea of games being 50 to 60 hours. I think we saw a lot of that, or have seen a lot of that. And anytime you have a 50 to 60 hour game, one that requires more overhead, more labor, you need more people, a bigger team, and the development time is going to be longer because it's a bigger game. That's going to impact cost. But I want to go to this one piece that really kind of stood out to me, and this is the part of when Sean Layden talks about sustainability of AAA games that people are missing. The single most important reason why the AAA, I'm quoting Sean Layden here, the single most important reason why the AAA model is unsustainable is not escalating costs or team sizes, though. Rather, it's one of those weird freaks of nature in my 25-year career in the game business. No matter how big the games get, the basic price has always stayed the same. The audience is very sensitive to the idea of it ever being higher. It's been, and this is, by the way, this is before games went to $70. He says, it's been $60 since I started in this business, but the cost of games have gone up 10 times. If you don't have the elasticity on the price point, but you have huge volatility on the cost line, the model becomes more difficult. I think this generation is going to see those two imperatives collide. Thoughts, Falky?
Yeah, there's so many different parts to that. So yes, $60 to $70 was a massive talking point, and the consumers cracked the shits big time over it. But you think about when $60 games started versus when they went up to $70, what a game looked like. When they made, let me think of our best way of contriving this. So when they made The Witcher 3, it was back in the mid-20 teens, early 20 teens, and that thing's huge. and it's modern day standards. You wouldn't build it like that today because it's too rough. You get slaughtered by the reviewers for not having the graphics good enough and the quality is not good enough and all this. Regardless about how great that game plays, and that's what should be important, is how does the game play. They would slaughter you for your graphical fidelity and your performance and all the rest of it, because that's what journalists and influencers and so-called experts like to pick on for some reason. They don't talk about gameplay anymore. But you contrast that with Baldur's Gate 3, and you look at the graphical difference between those two, and you're like, well, that extra few percent to make it really shine and polish and look as good as they can make it look, that takes a huge amount of labour and investment to do it. Now, is that going to be the case going forward? Probably not, because there's emerging AI technologies. There's emerging technologies that are solving these issues around how do we polish things up, how do we get them to happen faster. But in the effort of investing in technology to save labour, particularly labour time, at the back end of this development stuff. So the front end with all these games is the writers, the storylines, all the rest of it. You can't replace. I don't even want to go down that pathway of suggesting it can be replaced with technology. It can't. It won't. If you want a really, really good written game, you still need humans to write it. I'll argue that. I'll die on that hill. Because there needs to be emotion. There needs to be a lot of other stuff involved in it. But if you're talking about once you've got something designed and built and in there and animating it and then getting it through, set designs and environmental designs and all this other stuff of having to do all that repetitive crap, there's technologies that can make that happen really quickly. But instead of just saying, right, we can now build what was $100 million, we can now build it for $50 million because we've got all this other cool stuff to do it with, they go, well, instead of having... we could do it for $50 million and produce effectively the same as the last game, just different settings and some other minor tweaks and stuff like that, a la Crash Bandicoot 1 to Crash Bandicoot 3, for example. Let's take all that, instead of spending 2 years doing that, let's just take the whole 4 years that we had initially to begin with, and let's just put more shit in this because people are expecting more in these games because we want to charge them an extra $10. And that's when you start getting all these big additions in, an example be, you look at the first Ratchet and Clank game that came out on the PS2. Walk through, linear setup, backgrounds and all that were very much easily put together. You could tell that different worlds and different planets that you were visiting had similar builds. I remember the funny thing used to be in games, you used to go through all these different worlds and it was basically the same setup or the same environment, just a slightly different track of going through it. Way back in the day, remember the Sonic games were all basically the same shit for 2 hours, just running through these things. But these days, that's not good enough for the consumer, apparently. I don't know who decided that, but that's not good enough. So the last Ratchet and Clank game, you saw how much stuff was in that. And yes, it was to show off the power of a PS5, the SSD, and all the other stuff. So it gets a bit of leeway for being a technical marvel. But you look at how much stuff is in there and how long it takes to build that stuff. And you look at the difference between Spider-Man and Spider-Man 2, how much more stuff is in there. That stuff takes time to build. That stuff takes effort and it takes a lot of labor to build. But if that's the expectation of the consumer, that these masterpieces are just continuously pushing and pushing and pushing, then this idea of games cost more to make actually has two components, at least two components, if not the third one, to it. How much are we actually increasing in terms of what's in these games? And that's an additional cost because we've chosen to put more in there because we've got more time and resources to do it, versus how much in the savings that we've made because we know how to iterate and we know how to make these things happen faster. Because the more frequently you do something, the faster it becomes. And if you've got more experienced people working on it, your time compresses, or you get shorter time frames in delivering the outputs, so you have less labor costs. So typically what a lot of line managers will do is they'll go, oh, well, we'll just keep the time and the cost the same, we'll just expect more output. That's what, pressure managers do. Mm-hmm. Whereas you get the other ones that are more value perspective, and they go, right, well, if you can get that done faster, that's great. Then we'll move on to the next thing. We'll move on to the next thing and the next thing, and we'll just keep it at the same amount of output, and we'll just continue on. So there's an element there where they're chewing up the time saving, and they're not actually saving anything. And then there's an element of actually putting more into it because for some reason that's what they want to do. Various different reasons. I don't mean that in a bad way. It's just there's some reason that they want to do it. And then that sort of extra little third piece is, are we building a game because we're building a game, or are we building a game because we're trying to show something off? And this is where Sony's first party stuff comes to the fore. San Diego Studios builds MLB The Show every year, and it does iterations on gameplay, and it has the new character models and all that sort of stuff. That's their way of doing it because they got a license to do that, and that's what they do. Great. Look at what Insomniac's trying to do. It's doing sequels, yes, but it's iterating and making them better and better and better and better every time. But they're also pushing the point with, Spider-Man 2. Got ray tracing. You can't flick it on and off. It's just there. Because in their words, why, if we can make it work, why would we turn it off? And then you've got that voodoo magic stuff that they did with the 40 FPS. If you got the right TV, you can run most of these PlayStation games at 100 plus frames a second. And it's not taxing on any other performance metric, but it can then all of a sudden do it. And it's doing it with God of War Ragnarok and a few other games. To build that stuff into those engines, takes time, money, and effort. And it's not like these engines can just make it happen. Someone's got to go in there and do a lot of typing and make it work, and then test it and make it work and test it. So every time they're adding new stuff to it, there's an element of cost involved. Does that cost hit the P&L, or does it hit the balance sheet? That's an entirely different conversation that, yes, the bean counters have, because there's rules and regulations and all this other shit that needs to go on.
Yeah.
But if you just take it that the cost of development just goes straight to the profit and loss, well then, yeah, the tens and tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars to run these studios is costing a lot of money. But it doesn't mean that the cost of building a game is getting more expensive. And I'll use this as an example. Whatever Sucker Punch is building for Ghost of Tsushima 2, they've got, from the snippets that we've seen and we've heard and what they're saying and not saying and all the rest of it, that world is going to look dynamite. You thought the first one looked great. You wait till you see the second one. It's going to make Horizon Forbidden West look like it's standing still. They have taken the best of everything they can get their hands on, and they've just improved it. So the graphics are going to be excellent. The gameplay is going to be excellent. They've got great script writers and story writers over there. So, this thing is going to just, it's going to sing. But it's going to cost them a bomb to do it, because instead of just taking the first game, using the same engine, using the same assets, doing everything else, and only taking 2 years to release it with a different storyline, so say it's the second part to it, or they've got a different character running the same thing. They're not doing the Yakuza method, where they just grab the same city, make a few changes, keep the same characters, make a couple little changes, and just pile in all these different parts to the story, where they can just crack one out every second or third year. They've chosen to make this massive step forward to really show off what the technology they've got can do to the best of their ability, and what the system can do, the hardware can do. That's what PlayStation is typically doing. It's like, let's just push this thing until it melts and then see if we can push it a bit further. The Last of Us Part 2, my PlayStation 4 won't even look at it. It'd melt it. Trying to play the Final Fantasy VII Remake was the last full game I was able to play without it just heat stroking and dying.
I remember my PS4 Pro sounded like a jet engine.
Yeah, I've got one of the original PS4s with the 500 gig hard drive in it, the mechanical one. Man, that thing, you just turn it on, and it sounds like you're at the airport.
Yeah, I want to address.
That's the thing.
Yeah, real quick, Falk. I'm sorry to interrupt. I want to address something in the chat here. Ricardo 170 says, "BRAP. Also, this is a PlayStation problem. They only do expensive AAA games. Xbox creates small AAA and expensive AAA games." A couple things, Ricardo. If you're going to say it's a problem, then why are they continuing to invest in AAA games? If it's a problem, they wouldn't be doing that. I don't know if you probably missed the start of the podcast. This is what companies do. If something doesn't make financial sense and they're losing money and it just is like a money pit, then they wouldn't be investing. As I said to you, they wouldn't be investing. If you looked at, there was a bar graph that released, they're increasing their investment in AAA games. They wouldn't be having their studios right now working on new AAA games. We know Ben's studios working on a AAA game. But that aside, though, if you look at the budgets, Ricardo, for AAA game development, not just the PlayStation, but across the industry, if you were to believe that it's a PlayStation problem because of the costs associated with AAA game development, then I would imagine you would agree, Ricardo, too, that it's not just the PlayStation problem, because it would be an industry problem. It is Halo Infinite cost $500 million to develop. CD Projekt Red, the Cyberpunk 2077 game, cost $315 million to develop. So
and don't forget the $1 billion they had to give back.
Yeah, and then there's some, again, I don't think this has been corroborated, but there's some chatter out there that the Grand Theft Auto 6 is teetering at about $1 billion. Yeah, player. That actually is true. The Halo Infinite budget is $500 million. That includes marketing and everything else. That is actually true.
And that'd be the same for Grand Theft Auto 6. They're talking $1 billion in terms of cost. That's what, 10, 12, 15 years at whatever that team's been doing, and then marketing and all the rest of that sort of stuff. The budget might be $1 billion, but what are they going to make back out of it?
Yeah, and and so that's the thing. That is where I'm like, this is why I want to have this conversation, because I think there's some misconceptions here about PlayStation's costs associated with AAA game development. But it's not PlayStation. I mean, we go back to what Sean Layden's saying and what I said about the cost of video games. I mean, Sean Layden is saying, and this is the piece that people miss. I'm going to read this again. He's saying the single most important reason why the AAA model is unsustainable is not escalating development costs or team size. Rather, it's one of the weird freaks of nature in my 25-year career in the gaming business. No matter how big the games get, the basic price has always stayed the same. So if the price of, and this should just be, this should be common sense, I think, Falky. If the price to develop to manufacture a good goes up, but your cost to the consumer stays the same, of course that's not sustainable. That's why that's why you heard the CEO of Capcom say this past summer, and I'd have to pull the article, but if those who remember, the CEO of Capcom said, like, the cost of AAA game development, we're past the $70 now. That's not even really that's not covering costs per se. Like we need to no, play. Actually, that's actually. I know. Frank O'Connor said it's false, but it's actually true. It was marketing and everything. He may be talking about just the actual development, but marketing included and everything. $500 million. But yeah, I mean, but that's just common sense. And so when I saw it, when the leak came out and they mentioned, and Sony was talking about $80, $90, $100 games, I'm like, that could be a reality, because the cost to the consumer needs to keep pace with the cost of making games. And look, so long as there, and I say this, so long as there's the demand for AAA games and people are buying them by the millions, and that's happening right now. We see it. You look at some of the biggest titles of 2023. Many of them were AAA games. Just look at the Circana NPD numbers. Games that released at $70. Demand's there. These companies are still going to make it. And I would venture to say too, Falky, that the player says the problem with games going up in price is that they start to price them consumers out of the market. Okay, how's that different than any other consumer product, player? I mean, people are going to have to make choices. Go ahead, Falky.
He's using a narrowed data set, pulling it right down to saying the cost of AAA games for PlayStation, cost of AAA games in general. If the cost goes up, then the price goes up, and it puts people out of the market. Here's a counter argument for you. If you don't think that PlayStation is investing in smaller games like Xbox does with things like Hi-Fi Rush and Pentiment and all that sort of stuff, how do you think that studio survives? Oh, Jesus, who built Pentiment?
It was
I can't remember who built
Obsidian.
Obsidian built Pentiment, right? And they're plowing through trying to build Avowed. I think they're building Avowed. And they're just fumbling and fumbling and fumbling. How the hell do you think they made any money out of Pentiment to be able to fund that studio to keep building Avowed? They didn't.
Mm.
How do you fund a AAA game like Avowed? And everybody's, Avowed's going to be great. It's going to be this, going to be that. Or Perfect Dark, or Fable, or all these other big games that they're talking about doing. Where the fuck do you think the money's coming from? Because it's not coming from the gaming segment. It's coming from other parts of Microsoft backfilling these investments because they expect to get something out of it at the end. PlayStation's got the same frigging model. They just have a different way of funding it. But if you're going to have a crack about the cost of games gets way out of hand, it's unattainable for some, it's not exactly a cheap thing to get into to begin with. But if you wanted to, you can find plenty of games that are just as good at a lower price. They just weren't made by PlayStation or Xbox. And before you start saying it's a PlayStation problem, have a look at Nintendo and how much they charge for their games. And they never go on sale. So if you want Nintendo stuff, cheaper, you got to get it secondhand, or you got to get it on sale somewhere in physical media, because you can't get it off their store cheaper. But there are these things called third-party games that exist, and there's plenty of publishers and producers that build really decent AA and indie games and all this other stuff that are quite enjoyable, that plenty of people can access because the price point is extremely cheap. Now, before you start carrying on, anyone starts carrying on and saying, oh, Sony should do this, they do. They just don't have their own studios building it because the overheads would crush the studio and make it unviable to invest in. So they take the money and they put it through XDev and they put it through Shuhei Yoshida's team, they put it through Sean Benson's team and Greg Rice's team, where they go out to independents and they go out to small studios and they go out to third parties and they say, hey, we need games that fit this, what have you got? Or they go to the publishers such as the Big Six in Japan, or they go to EA's private division, or they go over to not Rockstar, what's it called, Take-Two, and they go to Ubisoft and all that. They're smaller publishing houses and they have constant meetings with them going, what have you got coming? And we'll talk to the developers and let's get a version put on PlayStation, so that there's more games there for people to play and people to buy at all different price points for all different genres. XDev is working their asses off in collaboration with second and third party developers, and Shuhei's team is constantly looking for indie games to bring to the platform, because PlayStation can't afford to invest in studios to build it themselves because the overheads are too big. The overheads will crush a small studio. But that doesn't mean that all these partnerships and all this other stuff that they're working with isn't a viable option of getting a game onto the platform. Now, just because it's not built by PlayStation doesn't mean it won't necessarily be an exclusive game, or it doesn't mean it's going to be a shit game. Mm-hmm. But there's plenty of options and opportunities around where, instead of taking money from the main corporate overhead and funneling it down to the bottom end studio to then suck all that money back out of them, there's no benefit there. There's no value there. They need to build a specific product in these studios to be able to generate that return on investment. That's that model. The other model is, I got plenty of cash, I'll get somebody else to do it for me, so I'll give them the funding and then they give me something back in return. There's less risk, there's less requirement and there's no overhead input, and all I need to do then is give them a couple of $1 million to fund it and provide some production support if they request it or if they need it, or technical support or whatever it is, to make sure it meets the quality standard. That's a much smarter way of getting that dollar to go further than, I'm just going to go out and start a new studio and hire all these people to make a small game like Pentiment or Hi-Fi Rush, or make another Gravity Rush game, which is a 8 to 10 hour thing. There's no way. You look at the first Uncharted. If they built that thing today, there is no way you would get that same game. You would get a 30 or 40 hour masterpiece that takes 6 years to build, or you would get the same game built for about $15 million. Because the technology would just do it in a heartbeat. But would they want to do that? No, PlayStation won't get Naughty Dog to do that. They'll get someone else to do it. Why do you think they farmed out the remaster? There's the stuff that feeds in, that the money generated from these studios, it has to give back to the overlord company. It's got to be big dollars or it's not worth doing. These are the things that need to be factored in
company.
when they do this. Yeah, that's what they are. They're the overlord. They're the Godfather wanting their cut.
Yeah, the money's got to funnel up. Yeah,
that's right. Someone's got to pay for the corporate overhead to exist.
Yeah,
you know, everyone says all these big money hungry giant global companies. They are money hungry. You know how much it costs to run one of those frigging things, and the regulatory shit that they've got to go through. It's insane.
Yeah, no, it really is.
To get to an end point of, is it worth investing in something? All of that has to be included. It's not just, we've got this little budget and we're just looking at direct costs of making the game, because it's then got to generate enough money to cover all this other shit.
Yeah, I want to address something. Places. I was just trying to say that if $100 becomes the new $70, that's going to price a significant portion of consumers out of the market. Look, player. I don't know if it'll price out a significant. You need to quantify that. Like, what do you mean by significant? Like 50%, 60%? I do think it'll price some people out, but I don't know if that's going to price enough people out where maybe publishers kind of take a step back and reevaluate pricing. I think from what we've seen is that, you know, even with the $60 to $70 increase, there's been no impact. I mean, if it goes to $100, maybe. I mean, I think it's, you know, and I think that $100 price point, I don't think we're, just my opinion, I don't think we're going to see that anytime soon. I could be wrong, but I don't think we're going to see that anytime soon. But I'm not so sure that it's going to price out a significant portion of the consumers. And if it does price out some of the consumers, there's other options to gaming, like this idea that, and I'm not saying you think like this, player, but I see this on social media, that you have a certain consumer base that feels entitled to cheap AAA games, and I'm like, you're not entitled to cheap AAA games. The cost of those games costs a lot of money, which is why they cost the most to buy. You know, if you want a cheaper experience, there's indie games, there's AA games, there's subscription services. They are cheaper ways to enter into gaming if a AAA game is outside your budget. I mean, like, I don't know, someone says you have to take into account how the average American's disposable income has kept up with rising inflation. So I
just wait till they're on sale, for fuck's sake.
I mean, okay, so I was gonna, yeah, I was gonna say that too, Falky.
Almighty.
You could wait for games to be on sale, and I got to be honest with you, the inflationary dynamics that have impacted the U.S. are you know. It's funny, like Hamp and I talk a lot about this, the recessionary dynamics or inflationary dynamics in the U.S. Although inflation has gone down, it's hovering, I think, about 3% in the U.S. now.
You guys are about to start some quantitative easing.
We are. Well, the Fed's going to be cutting rates. Obviously, I know food is still expensive, but like Max, the reality of the matter is, like, there are people out there in the U.S. that haven't been impacted by rising inflation. People who have higher levels of income. There's an interesting statistic that came out in August from Circana that showed that the U.S. households that U.S. households with a average annual income of $100,000 a year were driving hardware sales in the United States. They were the primary driver. And you look at the console numbers you look at the amount of consoles that PlayStation's been selling here in the US. I forget what they were. I think at one point they were like selling 60% higher than year over year. I'd have to go back and pull the numbers. So despite those inflationary dynamics, I mean, people are still spending money, is my point. I mean, people talk about inflation here in the U.S., Falky. I don't know if you kept speed with the inflationary dynamics here in the U.S., but one of the things that was driving the Fed mad was increased salaries, which is still happening. The consumer market was pretty consistent. Like, you know,
it comes down to whether you're shopping around or not. And so the inflation, I imagine that the US does it similar to Australia. How they work out the consumer price index is they go to the supermarket and they put the same things in the basket and they say, does it cost more or less than the last time we did this? But they only ever go to the fucking supermarket or all the different supermarket chains, and they're all price matched because you go to one, you go to the other, it's all the same. If you go to instead of buying your veggies at the supermarket or your fruit and vegetable supermarket, go to a greengrocer who's getting them directly from the markets and not having to pay transport and all the other crap that goes on top of having it in a supermarket. Yeah, the convenience goes away, but you can get them cheaper. Go to your butcher to get your meat. Go to your bulk supply warehouse to buy your cleaning goods and stuff like that. You'll get them cheaper because people don't want to put the effort in, so they pay that convenience tax to go to the supermarket to get it because it's all in one location. Well, guess what? When the price of everything goes up, it's not just the end point to the consumer that goes up, it's every fucking step along the way cops that increase. And that's where you get a compounding exponential increase in price at the supermarket. But if you don't want to pay that, get off your ass and go to your local greengrocer.
The other thing I wanted to mention too, Falky, is with the one thing that surprised me, and I don't mean to get into the U.S. Inflationary dynamics here in the U.S., but one of the things that was so surprising to me here in the U.S. is how how much U.S. spending, like I would have expected U.S. spending to go down, but we saw increases in U.S. spending over the course of 2023. To me, that's counterintuitive to this idea of, oh, well, we have these inflationary dynamics, everyone's hurting. I'm like, not everyone's hurting, and I'm not saying that no one's hurting. Certain people are hurting, but if you look at the spending trends of last year in the U.S., we didn't see the kind of impacts that I thought we were going to see. Spending was still pretty robust. I mean, this is why the Fed was so aggressive in increasing interest rates. They were trying to curb consumer spending.
Yeah, and that's an outdated theory where the same's happened here in a lot of different countries, which use the cash rate as the reserve banks use cash rate as their side of the lever for inflation, and then the governments have to do their spending bits and pieces or use immigration to sort of work the unemployment thing to try and balance things out. I need to try and keep it together. Since the 2008 crash, and it took till 2012, 2013 for things to get going again, the next generation of people coming through aren't buying houses, and they're debt resistant, they're debt averse. They don't want to buy a house, so they don't buy houses. They don't want to borrow money to buy a house, and they don't like credit cards, so they work, they save their money, they put their money away, and they invest their money. And that's a sensible thing to do because that's a return to 1950s, 1960s mentality of I won't borrow and live beyond my means. I will just save it up and live within my means. And most of the time these days, it means they're still living at home in their late 20s, early 30s. So because the interest rates only affect those that have got a mortgage, really, or a credit card, those that are borrowing money are the ones that are basically paying the price. So their spending reduces because they don't have the capacity to service the loan and do the extra spending. Problem is, a much larger portion of the populations aren't affected by that. So they're still continuing on at their normal rate. And in some instances, at an increased rate because they've got all this capital behind them that they're able to do it. Because when interest rates go up, so does the value of certain markets, and so does the returns that they're making on their investments. So they've got some surplus cash to throw around. It's completely counterpoint. It goes the opposite direction of what the Fed Reserves and the governments wanted to have happen. And that's how you end up in these, they're yanking interest rates through the roof and the spending keeps going up because the people that run these organizations haven't sat down and gone through the data of in detail, like minute detail, and gone through and done all that monumental research to go, what will actually happen? How will this affect going forward? It's like here in Australia, something like 45 or 48% of houses aren't owned by people in the country. They're owned by someone that lives abroad, and because they're rentals. So interest rates going up, they have to borrow the money here to buy them, obviously, but interest rates going up and down don't really affect them because they're not here. It's the people that are here in the country doing the spending that affects that inflationary point. And yeah, it's crazy how far they miss the target in some instances.
Yeah, it's interesting. You talk about like the targets. I mean, the blue chip consensus forecast for 2023, and this is for Q3 2023, was projected the disposable personal income for the U.S. was projected to be at 1.4%. Okay, this is what they were projecting for Q3 here in the U.S. It actually was at 3.8%.
Right. Yeah.
Unemployment was projected to be at 4.4. It came in at 3.7.
Wow.
Real GDP was predicted at 0.2%. It came in at 2.9% for Q3 here in the U.S. I tell you, it's funny. We our economic team puts out a lot of like white papers on economic trends and forecasting, and I think at some point they were kind of pulling their hair out because they were like, some of this just doesn't make sense. Like, we haven't hit a recession yet here in the U.S. We have this inflationary dynamic. The cost to borrow money has gone up. The interest rates have gone up, and yet spending is still robust here in the U.S. Consumer spending.
It's crazy, isn't it? Yeah. We're talking to our economist that works with the associated financial institutions that we're associated with. Their economist was saying that they expect, and this is just before Christmas, they were expecting in the outlook that by June the Fed Reserve in America could cut by up to 115 basis points, and that they were going to avoid a recession, and they were already pricing that stuff in. And I said, how the hell did they do this? Because the bond yields and everything was saying they were going to crash and crash hard. Forget a soft landing. It was going to hurt. And the response I got was, without going down this pathway, was, the GDP on their exports was far higher than they expected for that quarter. And I pondered it for a second, and I asked the question and said, GDP on their exports include their military stuff? And I got a smile. All that stuff that they've been sending overseas has got a big invoice attached to it.
Oh yeah, the military industrial complex.
Yeah. Forget the domestic numbers look horrendous. Mm-hmm. Like, you've seen all the layoffs that have happened just in the tech industry in the last couple of weeks around Christmas. Yeah. Broad scale layoffs, and the immigration issue that's coming across the borders in the southern part of the country. We're talking that it could be up to, what was it, by the end of 2025, something like 50 million undocumented people in America or something like that.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Yeah. The tech industry's laid off.
What some people are like.
Yeah, go ahead, Falky.
Oh no, it's just saying it's phenomenal the amount of cheap labor that's available in America at the moment. But yeah, just in the tech industry alone, you got the push from AI. You've got dwindling margins and all this other stuff that's occurring, and then you got this foreign exchange rate that's not favourable to anyone in the US. If they've got operations happening in the US, I should say, or as if they're overseas owned. It's the tip of the iceberg stuff.
Yeah, 230,000 people have been laid off in tech. Actually, were laid off in the tech industry 2023.
Yeah,
here in the US, 230,000 jobs.
Unity dumped 1,800 people, 25% of their workforce. Was it 25%?
And then Twitch.
No, Twitch dumped 25% of their workforce, and Unity dumped 1,800 people, and someone else dumped like nearly half their workforce the other day. And it all comes back to this: we're trying to get profitable and sustainable. Like, that's the key thing: profitability and sustainability, because they're two very different things. But you want both of them to happen. And then I know for a fact that the ABK settlement piece is going to incur some major layoffs. There's no way around that, because there's no way that thing can be profitable and sustainable without the layoffs. And then you've got heaps of other, gaming specific companies that are just going, like, look at Embracer Group. They're on a dump and pump strategy at the moment, and people are tearing their hair out going, why? And I'm like, this is basic venture capital behavior. It'll go on for a few more years, and then someone will buy it and they'll make a bucket load of money out of it when they sell it. But it's just the nature of the beast, and people forget these are businesses. Livelihoods are at stake. I don't want to make light of people getting laid off, because that's a horrible thing, but you walk into those industries knowing full well that you're not going in to be an accountant for the rest of your life in a cushy little office job, and all you got to do is just crunch numbers every day and collect your paycheck at the end of the week and do a good job, get it right, and you'll be good next week. These are projects. They have a start and a finish and a finite piece of work that you're going to do in between them. So you need to get, for anyone going into the industry, get really good at finding your next job, because you will spend your lifetime doing that if you're working on projects. It's the same in construction. It's the same in agriculture. It's the same as it is in any other tech company. You go in, you do your bit, you go to the next job. You do your bit, you go to the next job. If that's not something you want to do, don't get involved in that line of work.
Yeah. By the way, I just want to just mention something here in the live chat. Noel Origin says, console sales been stuck around 200 million for 20 years now. It's not getting bigger, so why not go day one on PC and mobile? If they don't, they won't grow. No, they can grow Noel Origins without putting their games day one on PC and mobile. You can actually, and this is something that came out of the leaked documents where Sony said they don't believe in the unification of platforms for one particular type of game. They're like, there's just too many differentiators in hardware specs. What they do believe, though, is making game content specific for certain platforms. So you would make a game that would be like a Candy Crush for mobile, but you wouldn't make a AAA game for mobile. So they can, there's different ways for them to generate revenue streams, but you got to remember something. Hardware sales is part of a core part of their Sony. Like, this is what I've said about these companies. And if you listen to their voice tracks, like Nintendo and Sony are in the business of selling hardware to get you to buy their software or buy software on their hardware. That's how they make money. The revenue in the console space, Noel Origins, the revenue streams or the amount of money they're making in the hardware space. The console business accounts for about 30% of the gaming business. It's up year over year, 2% in revenue. What they've been able to do is figure out other ways to, squeeze more pennies out of each consumer that owns a console. But they can do those things you mentioned, like in mobile, and they're kind of doing it with PC. I mean, that's why we see the AAA games going to PC. I'm not so sure that Day-Date's going to make it more money on PC, but they can do those other things in the mobile space without having to put their AAA games day in day. And they again, if you read the leaked documents, it's not the unification of platforms, which stark contrast to Microsoft's strategy, isn't something they believe works well.
It's one thing to say it's stalled at 200 million or whatever it is in terms of units, but you can grow revenue and have less units. One's not exclusively mutual to the other, particularly if you've got these inflationary factors and other pricing and costing stuff involved in it. But more to that point, if you went like day and date across all platforms, well, you miss out on the double dip for a start, and you miss out on the remasters, and you miss out on all this other stuff that these companies do to make money. And everyone goes, oh, it's predatory practices, it's not right, it's not this and like that. Twitter is not the whole gaming community, and Twitter is not the be-all and end-all of the conversation. If I want to play something on a console, I'll play it on a console. If I want to play it on a computer because it's a better suited game to playing on a computer, I'll play it on the fucking computer. But I also have a price point at which I will buy games, and it's not $70 brand new day one. And if we're going to have a discussion about what is value and what is not value, can we please have a game released that's not full of bugs and then needs a day one patch and a day 10 patch and patches for 6 months and then 12 months later the thing actually works? it's the concept of value is subjective to each individual, but what should be a minimum standard shouldn't differ across individuals. It should be, if that's the game and it's playable day one, then it should be all there. And because of this constant drive of wanting to find a way of trailing it off, we don't get that anymore, which is a shame because we should. But you go day and date with PC and console and the rest of it. Why would you want to do that? You're then having to build multiple different versions at the same time, and it just diminishes and costs more. You'd be better off to do what most developers and publishers do at the moment, and Capcom's probably the greatest example of this. They'll build one version and then port to the next version, but they don't do the port in-house. PlayStation's only just starting to catch up with this. There's other ones that do it as well. Build a game for one or the other, then once it's released and we've got some cash, then we port it. And it makes sense because, The Last of Us Part 2 remaster, remake, whatever the friggin' hell it is, with all this additional stuff that's going into it. It's probably only cost them $20 million to do it. They'll get $100 million out of it. The Last of Us Part 1 remake, remaster, whatever it was, they put it on PC. Only cost them $10 or $15 million to do that, and they get $100 million out of it. The return on investment is huge. So, why not?
Yeah.
Why would I want to go day one where I'm going to sacrifice hundreds of millions of dollars worth of revenue? It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah. I want to
remember.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say. Remember, me as the manager is not beholden to the customer. My job is to suck as much money out of the customer's wallet as I can that they'll allow me to, and give it to my shareholders. That's my legal responsibility.
That is a great way to sum up how corporations view consumers. By the way.
Yes.
Yeah. PlayStation Microsoft Gaming is definitely one that's making more revenue with way less consoles. $16 billion in 2022, $15.4 billion in 2023. Yeah, look, they're making a lot of revenue, obviously, but they also, that is through third party games like, Minecraft being the big one for them. And now,
where are they making it? Where are they making their revenue from?
Yeah.
That's the question you should be asking, because their subscriptions is fuck all. Their consoles sell at a loss, so they might be making $3.5 million in revenue of their consoles, but it's costing them $3.5 billion in revenue from their consoles, but it's cost them more than $4 billion to make them. If they wanted an increase to their bottom line, I mean, like bottom line earnings per share benefit, they just stop making consoles and they'll instantly get a bump. Instantly. And everyone goes, oh, but they'll lose that window to the storefront and all the rest of it. Like, you just said it yourself. Why not just put them all on PC? It's cheaper to do it on the PC because it already exists and they don't have to spend the money doing this. Clearly, someone wants to buy the consoles, so that's why the consoles exist. Someone wants to buy them, so they will sell them to them. What Microsoft need to figure out is how to sell them at a profit, not at a loss.
Yeah. By the way, Play, I wasn't disagreeing with you. I was just saying this is why their revenue. Wasn't disagreeing with you. That's why their revenue's gone up because of these acquisitions and the fact that they have these big IPs that are big revenue generators for them.
At $16 billion, Microsoft Xbox at $16 billion in revenue made give or take a couple $100 million, the same amount of revenue that Nintendo made in that year.
We don't know their operating profit though, do we?
No, we don't. But we know Nintendo made a really good operating profit.
What was Nintendo's operating profit like Q3 2023? Was it? What was it? Was it like $3 billion?
Hang on, I'll tell you.
I'd have to pull the numbers. Yeah, I know that Nintendo had.
I think it was pretty decent. The operating profit margin was 27%. So
yeah, everyone focuses on revenue, but the operating profit's a real. Correct me if I'm wrong here, Falky, but the operating profit is really the telltale of how healthy the business is.
Yeah. In US dollars, Nintendo's their gross profit was $6.5 billion, and their operating profit margin was 27%. That's 27% of, what did I say, 16 billion.
16 billion, yeah. It's about 3-something million. I'm sorry, billion.
Yeah. 4.32 billion.
Yeah.
That's not bad, 27% out of 16, but I guarantee you Xbox did not make that even close to going to that. it would have been flat out break. They don't publish the numbers. I don't see Xbox making any profit, net profit margin at 16 billion in revenue, not with the costs that they've got.
Yeah, that's why I always say
Not at
people
all.
like I know people discuss revenue a lot, and that's fine, but the telltale is operating profit. And I know the PlayStation operating profit took a hit. I think it was Q3 as well, but that had to do with big part of that was the result of the acquisition of Bungie.
Yeah, the final payouts for the Bungie employees.
Yeah,
but and again, it comes down to, we're talking about what game was funding that payout. Is it supposed to come from Destiny 2, or is it coming from the next game, or where was that money coming from? Because it's got to come from somewhere. The shareholders weren't stumping up the cash to pay out that acquisition. It was coming from somewhere. So back to this notion of games cost a lot of money. Yes, they cost a lot of money, not because of the direct cost of making the game, but because of the overheads that are associated with doing it as well. There's a reason why Ubisoft and EA and Take-Two and all that have now got their big publishing house and a small publishing house for the indies and the AA's. They couldn't get enough through their main house, and it was costing too much. So you set up another one with smaller overhead impact because of how you do cost centers and profit centers and all that stuff by rules and regulations, so they can actually make some more money. Because it's the throughput for those guys. They don't have a platform that they need to support. They've got to get things out there and people buying them. And they don't really care how you consume it. They just need you to pay for it.
Mm-hmm.
And they're the ones. So EA and Ubisoft and Take-Two, they're the three that are left, the big ones that are left, where the cost of AAA game development has outstripped what they're capable of doing. Because you look at their version of a AAA game versus what PlayStation, Nintendo, and Xbox, and I'll give them their credit, when they want to make a good game and they get it done properly, they do a good job. But the production quality of a AAA game from the platform owners is just streaking away down the track from what the third-party guys are capable of doing because of those cost inputs.
Mm-hmm.
And because they don't have the time to invest in it.
Yeah.
You imagine what that Jedi Survivors games would be like if you just give them another 12 months. Or you had, PlayStation Productions overseeing it.
I don't think EA wouldn't give them another 12 months.
No chance.
Got to get that game out. Got to get it on retail shelves. The bean counters want it out.
That's right. Hey, look, Ubisoft gets the shit kicked out of them all the time for that. Get the game out. Get the game out. We got a deadline to meet. Just get the fucking thing out. And we shit all over them because something's not working or something's got a bug in it or it's not quite there. They're on a deadline. Those guys don't bump games. They can't afford to bump games.
But this is why I always say, like, consumers need to speak with their wallets too. But the problem is they don't.
No,
so
they don't.
We get a game like Jedi Survivor, does well, like sales wise, but then it's just one of those gamers just need to speak with their wallets. Don't buy this stuff.
That's right.
Because if you don't buy this stuff, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, a couple of great examples. Prince of Persia, the new one. 8s, 9s, 10s. I think it's an 87, 88. Yeah. That's a decent game these days, right?
Smaller game, yeah.
It used to be a third-person action-adventure lineal thing similar to what first a couple of Uncharted's were, right?
Mm-hmm.
Start here, finish there, go through this pathway, puzzles, complexes, and all the rest of it. Fairly dry, empty. There's a couple of enemies here, a couple of enemies there. Not much going on. If they tried to remake that in today's standard, you're looking at 150 million and 4 or 5 years to build it. So to fix that problem, they went, fuck it, let's make it a 2D side-scrolling Metroidvania style, because then we don't have to worry about all this environmental stuff. We don't have to worry about all this camera angle stuff. We don't have to worry about all this other crap. We can just make a focus on the gameplay and how we traverse through these puzzles. So they took it from 3D, compressed it back to 2D, or 2.5D, however you want to call it, and they've made a game that is good. And it's not $70.
It's $50.
It's $50. So now they've taken an IP, remodified it, made it something that's enjoyable and playable, and people are going to have fun with it.
Yeah.
And it'll be in Game Pass and PlayStation Plus and all the rest of it in 12 or 18 months. And it'll be on sale for half price in 12 months. So, but they had to get a return on it, and they had to figure out how to make it happen.
You know what's interesting, Falk, is that I'd love to pick Matt Piscatello's brain on this. Matt from Circana, formerly MPDs, tweeted out that $50 for that type of game, for the new Prince of Persia, is expensive for that type of game. And I'm like, is it? Like, I didn't even think about the $50 price point, to be honest with you. You know, but
I'd have thought,
yeah,
I'd have thought 40. I'd have thought $40 was where it was at. But that's, again, they don't have any choice because they started it and then they had to restart it, and now they got to recover all this cost.
Mm-hmm.
So why not? Why not try it at $50 and see what happens? And if in 2 months' time or a month's time it's just not selling, drop it to 40 and off we go again.
Yeah, but if it sells at 50, though, it's going to be interesting how that impacts the pricing of similar games moving forward.
Yeah, again, you know, the pricing of games. If you've got a 15-hour linear story game that is just well written, well done, it is just an absolute masterpiece, and that's $60. And then you've got a 300-hour open world, multiple endings, friggin' pick your own adventure thing. That's $60. What point do you have a metric or a benchmark or a set of standards or something to mark against that all games can be held against, as we say this is value and this is not? Because without that benchmark and without that set of standards that everybody agrees to be marked against, we're just pissing in the wind, really.
Yeah. Sorry, Falcon, read the chat here. I get a little distracted sometimes, Falcon, right. Read the chat.
No, that's all right.
There's some good conversation here. Mm-hmm.
No, that's right. To tie back to something we were talking about earlier, for an example, in terms of return on investments and all the rest of it, Spider-Man 2, I think it was $220 million direct budget, and then you've got all the other SG&A stuff on top of that. If the SG&A was $20 million, which say 10% of the development budget is what you get for your marketing and your selling expenditure and all the rest of that, fair enough, because that's $20 million. And you would have said, well, they probably spent $20 million, all the marketing they did on it. And they sold 5 million copies in 11 days. They'd already made a 40% return on investment in the first week. In that first 2 weeks after launch.
Yeah, I forget the sales numbers.
God of War Ragnarok absolutely pissed it in. Like, it was, what was theirs? Hang on, I got it here in front of me. God of War Ragnarok did 11 million in 75 days. And if you, let's just say it's got the same. Let's say, for argument's sake, it cost 220 million to make as well, and it got the same treatment. It's already over 200% return on investment. So it's paid for itself, and it's paid for the next two games.
Yeah.
Spider-Man 2 is paid for the next one already. Like, and this is the, you know, the whole, I hate the terminology, but the whole pressure creates diamonds. I hear that a lot. HR people love to use that one. Sorry, mate.
But it does, though. I mean, this is also a scenario where, I've always understood gaming, especially AAA game development, high risk, high reward.
Yeah, Factions too. They've poured tens of millions of dollars into that thing, and it's just on a shelf.
Yeah, it's on a shelf.
And it'll probably sit on a shelf. And that's not to say that they won't take parts of what they've done in that and put it somewhere else, because you see bits and pieces of a PlayStation game in other PlayStation games.
Mm-hmm.
Playing Ghost of Tsushima, and I see bits and pieces from Naughty Dog. I see bits and pieces from Bend. I see bits and pieces from Guerrilla. It's sharing of technology and sharing of different asset structures and methods of doing things, and that's great. That's how they create value in saving time of doing something.
Well, there's a high level of collaboration amongst those studios. Like that's actually been documented, discussed quite a bit with PlayStation. Yeah.
Yeah, and it comes back to the point I made in the start of it. Just because they're saving time means saving money, but they don't bank the saving. They redistribute the saving to put more into the game, and that's where I have a difference of perspective and I should say a difference of opinion. I don't think Sean Layton gets enough respect for what he started in gaming, for the pathway that he started in gaming, particularly with his time as the boss at Sony. But I also don't think that his predecessors get enough respect for them continuing down that pathway. And yeah, AAA game development's getting a bit ridiculous, but it's not getting ridiculous in terms of the cost of developing the games are spiraling because of an uncontrolled event. the cost of the games are spiraling because of controlled decisions or decisions made purposefully to spend that kind of money. If they chose to not spend that kind of money, you can quite easily get a game that's very, very similar. It won't just have the spit and polish on it. But then if you're not going to push the envelope with the technology and continue the iterations and advancement forward, then what's the point? You might as well just do what Nintendo does. Just run it out, 5-year-old technology, put it into a device and sell it for the next 10 years and just go, hey, here we go. It's cost, what costs you $100 million to make for PlayStation, you can make for $20 million for us. And we've got 130, 140 million units out in the wild. Even if you have a 5% uptake, you're still in the cash. You're still counting green within weeks. So, volume, quality, quantity, different business models, comparing them is just... Yeah. But, sorry, the point I was going to make was, Sean, I think it's a conscious decision in a lot of instances that AAA game development studios choose to make in that push forward. Now, you see the difference between the platforms and the non-platforms. I just mentioned that before. But the platform holders have that capability, and they can shelve a couple, but they can't shelve them all. So at some point, they've got to kick something out that works, and that's why all the studios for PlayStation now got 2.5 teams. They've got a pre-production team and 2 that are building something, one each, building something. But I don't agree that it's spiraling, like that it's getting to a cost point where it's uncontrollable and it's unsustainable. It's a conscious decision being made. And I know for a fact they've got some really smart people at these organisations making these decisions. And hey, sometimes they don't pay off. That's the risk that goes into it. But like in construction, sometimes you build a high-rise building and no one wants to buy it. It's just the nature of the beast. Or you buy something, renovate it, and no one wants to buy it. That's just the nature of the beast. If you get, with this whole games as a service thing with PlayStation, they had 10, they've now got 9. We don't know what's included, or we know of 6 of them. Faction's been shelved. The other 5 we know when they're coming. The only one that we don't know of all the details on is whatever Ben's building. But if they launch 10, or they build 10, they launch 8, 2 stick, and they get 7-8 years out of them, that's a success. That's not a failure. It's a success. Because what they're trying to find is a way of tapping into that revenue stream. And if that doesn't work, then they've got partnerships and third parties that they can just leech off anyway. So, they're just finding more ways of sucking your wallet dry. And the more fingers that they've got out there and able to sort of siphon a bit here and a bit there, if you can siphon 1% from every transaction, you'll make billions of dollars really quickly.
Like how you said siphon. It sounds so like anonymous.
Well, you think of it like with their investment with Epic. So Tencent and Sony have got an investment in Epic, right? Which means every return that comes down through the shareholders, they're getting some money out of that. But they're also getting money. They get access to the Unreal Engine for free. There's no licensing fees in that because they're a shareholder. So they're getting access to the Unreal Engine for free if they want it, though PlayStation doesn't seem really interested in using it. And they get 30% from the storefront for all the games that get sold, and they've got the deal with Fortnite to take a chunk of that as well. They're getting money at the front end and at the back end. It's, and they're doing the same with all the other investment ones they've got. It's just access to a bit here and a bit there, and if you put a little bit of cream on this one and a bit of cream off that one, a bit of cream off that one, by the time you get to the end of it, you get this big chunk of cream coming through, and you've done absolutely nothing to get it. Like, they're doing nothing in terms of cost output to get it. That's why the storefront's great for PlayStation to have all those third-party things selling like hotcakes through them. They don't have to put any money into it, and they're getting money back. The only thing that it costs them is to keep the storefront running.
Yeah. No, it's very insightful, Falky. And those are aspects. This is why I say that this conversation is so much more nuanced than people realize or give it credit. And that's why I think it's important to have these conversations so people get a better understanding of how these organizations are ran, kind of what goes into, 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 what goes into the cost of making video games.
Yeah.
And also, I wanted to do this too to clarify what Sean Layden was discussing, because people have taken out of context what he's saying. They're missing the part two to his unsustainability comment. It's not the reason people think it is. It's really, again, the increasing price. I'm going to say this again for those who arrived here late. I'm going to quote this again. The single most important reason, according to Sean Layden, why the AAA model is unsustainable is not escalating development costs, or team sizes, though. Rather, it's the one of the weird freaks of nature, and we saw this when they increased the price to $70. In my 25-year career in the gaming business, no matter how big the games get, the basic prices always stay the same.
Yeah. So you've got and it comes down to that scale of economics. I don't think anyone on Twitter's got any real concepts about, like the general Twitter fanboys got any concepts about economics, but if your price point is the same and you've got an increase in costs, then you've got to sell more of them.
Yeah.
If you've got a fixed price point, you've got to sell more of them. You've got no other option.
Yeah.
If you've got and that's why businesses would prefer a variable price point, because then you can say, well, I'm going to increase my price and I'm going to sell less units. But if I sell less units, I've got less distribution costs and I've got less production costs. And this will tie back to a conversation you and I had years ago now.
Did it Strauss Zelnick? Real quick, did it Strauss Zelnick hint that? I have to go back, and the quote about we should charge X amount of dollars for games depending on like how many hours a game is or something. I'd have to go back and pull that article, but
he said that the cost of games should be tied to their play times or something like that.
Yeah.
But you and I had a conversation years ago now around when it went up to $70 and all this and that. Everyone said, oh, if they're selling them digitally, why do they cost the same? Well, for a couple of different reasons that are, litigation and legislative and all the rest of it. Running the storefront is not necessarily cheaper to the platform owner than selling them physically, because physical sales, once they've printed it and they've shipped it out of the warehouse, just costs aren't their problem. But the storefront, to run that thing, cost is their problem. And that requires data engineers, server banks, shitloads of electricity. It requires internet connectivity. It requires blah, 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 infinite more than what they would have had if they'd have just sent one disc to the printing press and said, print 2 million copies of this and send the bill to whoever the distribution point person is, because they're going to pay to have them printed, and then they're going to on-sell them to the retail marketers. Digital media is actually more expensive to the platform holders than physical media. Yet people have got this warped sense that platform owners want to go to digital because it's cheaper. Well, it's not. They want to go to digital because they get better data out of it. And they can milk more money out of you because they can see your spending habits and your gaming habits and all the rest of that. That's why they want to have connectivity.
There's value in information.
Information has always been, ever since, the only Carthagins walked across the river and decided to have an argument with someone. Information is infinitely more valuable than anything else in any point of business.
That's so true. A lot of people don't realize that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's Facebook. That's what they're in the business of doing.
That's why Facebook's so valuable. Yeah. They've got all this information, and it's not necessarily personal information now. It's all business. When Facebook started, everyone was a person, and they opened it up to businesses, and then all these businesses flooded for advertising, and now Facebook's got more information about businesses than they do about individuals. And that information is even more valuable for the business-to-business engagements, because that's where the real money is.
Yeah, the business they'll sell Microsoft. Facebook will sell that information to businesses.
Absolutely.
Grow the business, yeah.
A B2B, business-to-business transaction is infinitely more lucrative than a business-to-consumer transaction, because consumers are fickle and they've never got much money, and I mean that in a nice way. They're really frugal about what they spend their money on.
Facebook is vastly different than when it was when I first joined in 2005.
Oh, yeah.
It is literally. And by the way, Forte, I don't know how this happened. Forte's Facebook page came up as a friend recommendation, as did Lord Cognito, and I'm like, what? Like, Facebook, how do you know that I know these people?
Yeah, they update their terms of service all the time. there'll be some little thing in there when you're going, yeah, agree, where they're now scouting through your phone contacts and they're matching it up, and they'll backfill the data from the other person. If you click yes, friends request, yes, I agree, they'll backfill the gaps in that other person's data in their own back-end database. Because I got a couple of friends on Facebook, contacts on Facebook, they never put their phone numbers in, and neither do I. And they're chatting there one day, and it was like, oh crap, how did my phone number get in there? Because they had me in their phone, and they went, oh, not following him anymore, must be one of those weird things. They hit yes, accept, and bang, all the data out of their phone landed in my profile.
Interesting.
There's different ways of skinning cats, because my profile with a phone number in it is infinitely more valuable than my profile without a phone number in it.
Yeah, that's true.
So, anyway, I don't mean to be a pain. I got to get going, mate.
Yeah, me too, Falky. Actually, need to wrap this up. It's getting close to the 10 o'clock hour here on a Saturday night. You are already Sunday afternoon or morning?
Yes, just coming up to 2 p.m. on Sunday afternoon, and it has been a glorious day, but there's now clouds rolling over, and before it rains, I've got to get the washing off the line.
I tell you what, it is.
And get ready for the week ahead.
Yeah, it's always it's so funny. I always it's great how you're always like a day ahead.
Yeah, you'll ring me one day. You'll message me and I won't respond, and you'll be like, "Oh crap, it actually finished. World has ended."
Exactly. Where's Falky? Yeah.
Nah, all good.
Yeah, but Falky,
happy days, mate.
Yeah, you too, Falky. Thank you so much again for joining us. This is very impromptu as always. I appreciate your time. I know you're literally on the other side of planet Earth, and so I really appreciate it. I know there's a significant time difference here, but yeah, we'll have to get you back on again sometime soon, Falky.
Absolutely, pleasure to be here. Keep safe, everyone. Enjoy, and all the best for 2024.
Absolutely, and everyone, please do me a favor, hit that like button if you haven't done so. Subscribe and hit the bell notification so you're alerted when we go live. We'll be back for our regular scheduled BRAP this Wednesday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. Everyone have a great rest of the weekend, and we'll catch you next time.